Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this third appointment of the IDEA4RC webinar series. We currently have about 25 online participants, so thank you for joining. And now let's start. First of all, I will briefly introduce myself. My name is Luna Rotondi. I work for Alliance Against Cancer, which is the National Oncology Research Network in Italy, and we are co-leader of Work Package 10 in the IDEA4RC project. So it's my pleasure to host this webinar and introduce our speaker. Vasiliki Tsiompanidou is a legal researcher at the European Centre for Certification and Privacy, which serves as the Ethics and Data Protection Officer within the IDEA4RC project. So please, Vasiliki, you are welcome to introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So, as was already mentioned, yes, my name is Vasiliki, and I am a lawyer and legal researcher. In the context of IDEA4RC, we are part of work packages 2, 10, and 11, mainly focusing on ensuring the project's ethical and legal compliance, as well as its compliance with intellectual property rights needs.
Okay, thank you, Vasiliki. Now I will share my screen. So you should be able to see my presentation. Okay, this webinar will focus on the secondary use of health data, also explaining how the IDEA4RC technical components are designed to meet the EHDS legal requirement. And now I'd like to draw your attention to the agenda for today's webinar. After a short introduction, we will have Vasiliki's presentation, and then we will hold a Q&A session where you can raise your hand to pose your question directly, or if you prefer, you can use the chat. After that, we will launch a live opinion poll to collect your feedback and your points of view as expert. And finally, we'll conclude with a quick reminder about the next coming appointment. Now, just a few words to introduce the community. The webinar series is an initiative launched by IDEA4RC Community to raise awareness and I'm sorry, about the project among different healthcare actors. The scope of the IDEA4RC community is to engage a wide and diverse group of stakeholders in the co-creation of the IDEA4RC data ecosystem by fostering an open dialogue. This collaborative approach allows stakeholders to provide valuable feedback and recommendation on the project developed according to their field of expertise. The community was launched last June, starting with Hurricane patient advocates, and has grown up to over 50 members across the different healthcare and research sectors, as you can see from the PI chart. So if you wish to join us, you can scan the QR code and subscribe to our community to stay tuned on the next activities. So now I'm very glad to give the floor to Vasiliki for her presentation. Please, Vasiliki, could you share your screen?
Yes, of course.
Perfect.
Okay. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, this is perfect. Thank you very much. So, as Luna mentioned, we will now be delving a bit deeper into the European health data space regulation and how this is affecting the use and reuse of health data within Europe, and more specifically as well, how this is affecting the IDEA4RC ecosystem and how the IDEA4RC ecosystem has been designed precisely to be aligned with this framework. But before we go into that, I would like to start with a bit more general of a discussion, focusing a bit more on the data sharing part specifically for research. Of course, we all know that currently data is very, very valuable in performing all of the everyday activities, and industry included, as well as research. Data, particularly in research, is crucial in order to be able to perform all of the activities that have been envisioned on one hand, but also to be able to validate the research results and outputs, leading to better quality of results, and thus better quality of innovation solutions to be proposed. However, when we are discussing specifically data in research, we always need to be mindful of the need to abide by the FAIR principles and open data principles. The FAIR principles, of course, include the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data within research. And all of these principles lead us to one common goal, let's say, and that is to be able to provide data to the public precisely in order to be able to share knowledge and disseminate any results and useful outputs that could be reused by other parties. And in this greater framework, especially when we are discussing the use of personal data, which is the case in the European Health Data Space Regulation as well, the General Data Protection Regulation is very much of relevance, as this is currently the framework under which data can be shared and processed and used in order to be able to perform research. And the importance of research has already been accounted for in the GDPR by allowing for a research exemption in order to be able to perform research upon health data. Now, data, though, is very useful both in the secondary use of health data, meaning when you already have the data for a different purpose and you reuse it in order to be able to perform research or other activities, or the primary use of health data, which includes the use of data in order to be able to provide healthcare services, to provide prescriptions, and satisfy patients' needs. And the European health data space actually covers both. As I briefly mentioned, the current framework is ruled by the General Data Protection Regulation, which of course requires the need to comply with certain elements and certain principles, which I very, very briefly would like to mention here, as the center of this webinar is not the GDPR, but it is very important to have this background in order to move into the European Health Data Space Regulation. And the main element that we need to take into account when we are trying to comply with the General Data Protection Regulation is, of course, lawfulness, and the need to have a legal basis in order to be able to collect and process the data. Especially when we are discussing health data, we also need to be able to recognize that we are aligned with one of the exemptions, among which the research exemption, in order to be able to process health data. So specifically for health data, we need to be able to identify a research exemption according to Article 9 and a legal basis according to Article 6. Now, these legal bases can be multiple. It can be consent, it can be the need to comply with an obligation provided by law, or the need to process the data for purposes of public interest, including public health. And this is very much dependent on each and every situation and scenario. Similarly, the GDPR requires that any data processing is fair and transparent, meaning that data subject must be able to, on one hand, acquire all of the information that is required in order to be able to understand and fully follow how their data is being used, for which purposes, by which actors, etc., etc., but also for them to be able to exercise the rest of their rights, like the right to rectify their information if any mistake occurs, to object to any processing if need be, etc. That being said, the GDPR is very much highlighting the need to only use the data that is required in order to meet the purposes for which the data was collected. And this is very much aligned with the principles of data minimization and purpose limitations, meaning the data can only be processed for the purposes for which it was originally collected, unless, of course, you have a specific exemption or a further processing compliance. And of course, the GDPR is very big on ensuring data confidentiality, trying to protect as much as possible the confidential character of personal data. Now, as I mentioned, of course, the GDPR has taken into account the need to perform research and has provided this framework allowing for the performance of research. That being said, it still presents a number of challenges, specifically when it comes to health data and specifically in the cases of using health data for research purposes. Starting with what I already mentioned, which is the lawful basis. And I mentioned some examples here where this might be a problematic part when trying to use data in order to perform research, because let's take consent, for instance. With consent, you need to request the patient to consent after having received all of the information about the specific data processing, the specific purposes, the specific stakeholders, meaning the specific research project. Now, if you have already collected the data and you're trying to perform a retrospective study, for instance, then you would have to go back to every single data subject that has provided you with the data in order to ask for their consent anew. Similarly, if you have acquired their consent for any reason, whether that was for the provision of healthcare services or for a different research project, you still have to face the issue of having to go back for each and every single research project and request their specific consent for that new research project that you are trying to have. As you can understand, this can be very complex, especially if we're talking about a large scale research project where there are a multitude of personal data involved. And of course, it is very difficult to not only track down the patients, because you never know, maybe they have changed their addresses, their contact information. They are never obliged to inform hospitals, clinics, or healthcare providers about such elements, or just because it is not cost and time efficient. Similarly, the research exemption, albeit a very useful tool, still presents certain challenges, including the fact that member states have had the room in order to further align it in their national legislation and further define how the research exemption can be used. This has, of course, resulted in a very significant loss of homogeneity among member states in their legislations as to how the research exemption can be used and under which conditions. And in many member states, we see the instance of needing still consent, even though you're relying on the research exemption, which of course causes a lot of hurdles for research projects such as IDEA4RC, where the research partners are located all throughout Europe. Similarly, one of the very big challenges is to be able to determine whether the data can be pseudonymized or anonymized and what the results of that would be for the research project, for the quality of the results, etc. And also that leads us to a very important issue, which is scalability. Because of course you can identify and define all of this for one specific research project that maybe has a few partners all located in the same country, but when multiple actors are involved, things get significantly harder. Now, the EHDS has been called practically to address some of the challenges that I just mentioned, including the challenges of individuals having difficulties accessing their own health data and controlling it and understanding better how it's used, and to take more control over them, let's say. And similarly, healthcare professionals, policymakers, but also researchers are having a lot of difficulties accessing the data for any purpose, whether that's to provide healthcare services or to perform research. Similarly, if researchers and the industry do not have access to health data, innovation is facing also a lot of hurdles. That being said, the European health data space objectives can be distinguished into two sets of objectives, one for the primary use and one for the secondary use. Regarding the primary use, of course, the European health data space regulation is here to ensure cross-border access to digital health services and products, to enhance the sharing of patients' data across borders, and to grant citizens more control over how their data is used. While for the secondary use, the important points are the enhancement of the use and reuse of health and medical data, providing access to large-scale health data in a clear and structured manner, and of course, to promote and facilitate research. As you can understand, this has not been an easy journey, as these objectives are also very sensitive for member states themselves, since they affect their own, let's say, very private sphere of public health, which is always heavily protected. Hence why the EHDS was first proposed in May 2022, and it wasn't until April 2024 that it was finally approved, and it was actually this month that the official text was published in the journal. Does this mean that starting from now, the EHDS is in force, everything is in place and running? No. It's never that easy, it's never that straightforward. Since now it was published on the official Journal of the European Union, it won't be for the next 2 years that the first phase will be implemented. Here you can see a bit the general timeline. So March 2027 is actually the first phase of general implementation, while March 2029, all of the EHR systems are supposed to be in place, and this is the start of the general implementation phase for the secondary use. As I move further and I delve deeper into what the requirements are for the secondary use, it will become apparent why it was necessary to have this larger time frame in order to be able to implement actually the secondary use of data requirements. 2 years after that, of course, the EHR systems must be certified and meeting all of the interoperability requirements, and the secondary use of data is expanding to more areas, including genomics and wellness applications, while starting from 2034. Cooperation is supposed to be established with third countries and international organizations in order to promote the secondary use of data specifically. Now, I would like to take a very brief moment in order to give a short overview of what the primary use of data entails, according to the European Health Data Space. And this is actually focused on the establishment of a European electronic health record. This means that personal electronic health data, including patient summaries, electronic prescriptions, medical images and reports, lab results, will be part of this electronic health record. And this is supposed to be used in order to facilitate cross-border healthcare services provision, whether that's direct healthcare services, so going to a hospital and receiving healthcare services from doctors or clinics, etc., or in order to be able to acquire your prescriptions of medication or other treatments in other countries. Now, in this entire context, of course, it has been very, very important to the EHDS to further facilitate patients' rights and, of course, to provide data subjects and patients in this scenario with the opportunity to better receive copies of their own data, so to be able to transfer the data from one state to the other to receive healthcare services. That practically means, let's say, of course, as you can see, I am Greek. So in principle, most of my health record is in Greece, but I have lived in multiple countries across Europe. And now with the European Health Data Space in place, I wouldn't have to go to each and every center and doctor and again provide all of my medical history and come with translated copies in many instances of my existing records in order to be able to receive healthcare services there. Similarly, if any information needs to be corrected, the European Health Data Space provides this requirement in order for patients to be able to electronically correct it in an easy manner. And of course, patients have the right to be informed about who has access to their data and under which circumstances. In this scenario, the European health record has been built upon three main elements, and that is interoperability, so that actually health records can be transmitted in an easy manner, as I described. Similarly, personal data protection and cybersecurity, so that the data that is included in the record are not compromised in this transfer or even the storage. What is a bit more important for us here today, especially for the IDEA4RC project, because the IDEA4RC project is not focusing on the primary use of data according to the European Health Data Space, but it is focusing on the secondary use of data. And what the European Health Data Space provides is this obligation for data holders, meaning hospitals, clinics, practically any entity holding data on patients, well, health data, not specifically on patients necessarily, to make them available for research purposes, for the development of products and services for public health, social security, for public interest and public health purposes, for official statistics, for education and teaching activities, for training and testing algorithms for medical devices, as well as for personalized healthcare. Now, the list of data that the secondary use of data actually includes is quite long and quite substantial. Of course, it includes the European health records, the electronic health records, but it also includes any type of data that can impact health, including social, environmental, behavioral elements, as well as pathogen genomic data, health-related administrative data, and the list goes on. So it has a very long list of data that can actually be processed for these purposes. Now, how is this actually structured? We will see it in a bit because I skipped a slide. So what is really important here to highlight is that data cannot be used for any and all purposes. We already went through for what purposes it can be used, but there are also very specific practices that are completely prohibited. And that includes any practice that can produce decisions detrimental to natural persons, any decisions that exclude natural persons from insurance contracts or result in an increase in their premiums, any advertising or marketing, any unlawful dissemination of data, and the development of harmful products or services. Meaning, if you want to use the data that is included in the European Health Data Space, these cannot be the goals or the purposes, and it very, very specifically needs to be excluded as well. Now, I will go a bit over the roles that appear in the European Health Data Space, starting, of course, with the health data access bodies. Now, health data access bodies are supposed to be established in all of the member states, whether that's only one health data access body or multiple, as the European Health Data Space does not provide such limitations. And health data access bodies are actually in charge of managing the data access applications and everything that has to do with them. This means that they are the ones receiving it, they are the ones reviewing it, they are the ones deciding upon it, they are the ones supporting public institutions, member state institutions in carrying out all of these tasks. And of course, they do process electronic health data from the data holders under certain circumstances in order to be able to provide those services. Now, data holders, as I mentioned, can be hospitals, they can be public health bodies, it can be pharmaceutical companies, meta companies, etc. And their purpose within this framework is to make data available, to provide a description of data sets, metadata, and any documentation to that end. And all of this must be done through a trusted environment for data use. Similarly, data users can be researchers, policymakers, industry, anyone who wants practically to process the data for the purposes mentioned before. And they are the ones that have to complete and submit the data access applications. They have to use the data only for the purposes for which the data permits have been granted, and only according to the conditions of the data permit that has been granted. And they have to share the results back with the health data access bodies, who will then share them with the data holders. Now, the EHDS in this regard has certain very, very important requirements, starting, of course, with transparency. Any data that will be a part of this ecosystem for the secondary use needs to be very transparent. So that means that health data access bodies need to very clearly and explicitly provide the requirements under which the data can be used. And similarly, patients need to be in the position to understand why their data is being used, how it is being used, and they can also oppose to it, meaning they can request not to be included in this data sharing, let's say, ecosystem. Of course, fees may be applicable in order to be able to sustain this ecosystem. That being said, the fees are not meant to provide any profit, but they are only there to ensure that the data holders are able to provide this information to data users. And of course, are very much in line with the GDPR, the EHDS again states the need to abide by data minimization and purpose limitation, while also focusing heavily on the need to provide adequate metadata and ensure the data quality. And of course, last but not least, the need to provide for a secure processing environment where data can be processed without risking, on one hand, identifying the data subjects to which the data belongs to, because precisely the idea is that it is not the raw data that is being shared, but it is anonymized or pseudonymized data, so that data subjects cannot be identified, that can be processed within this environment. And of course, security, including cybersecurity, physical security, also needs to be taken into account when establishing this framework. Now, the European Health Data Space also refers back to the Data Governance Act concept of data altruism in health. Now, data altruism actually involves the voluntary sharing of data on the basis of consent of the data subject in order to process their data for objectives of general interest, including healthcare, scientific research purposes, etc. And it explicitly states that health data access bodies are supposed to support data altruism activities. The reason I like to mention it here is precisely because our next webinar will focus exclusively on data altruism and how the IDEA4RC ecosystem has envisioned the data altruism activities to take place within its ecosystem and within its framework. That being said, now that we have seen a bit how the European Health Data Space is supposed to work, I think it's time to review a bit its effect on the GDPR. And this is a very key point, that the GDPR is still in force. Nothing changes. You still need to comply with the GDPR, although I know many people are not happy about it. But it specifies certain elements, providing a more detailed framework as to how certain obligations need to be aligned in order to be able to perform research on data. Now, we mentioned before the problem of the lawful basis. Now, with the introduction of the European Health Data Space regulation, we now have a homogeneous lawful basis, meaning we have the legal obligation to share data. It also highlights the need to implement adequate technical and organizational measures, again, focusing heavily on the need to pseudonymize the data before sharing it with data users, while the GDPR roles of data controller, data processor remain very much applicable where personal data is actually processed. And of course, the EHDS is providing further information about the contractual requirements in order to be able to perform research and identify a bit the roles and the requirements and the obligations. Now, the IDEA4RC ecosystem has taken all of that into account, and this is a very simple example of how it is structured. So on one hand, we have the data user who is interested to acquire access, well, to use the IDEA4RC data, that is a better term, I believe, in order to perform research on rare cancers. Now, the user can use the IDEA4RC interface in order to see what type of data sets are included in the IDEA4RC ecosystem. And once they have decided that indeed the data sets that are there are very relevant for them, they can file the application in order to acquire a data permit online. So all of the information is filled in through the IDEA4RC interface, and all of the documentation that is required is uploaded directly there. Now, the data holders that will be receiving and reviewing this application in this context, the IDEA4RC in ecosystem, will determine whether that's something they would like to move forward with or not. And if all of the requirements are met, they will grant the data permit. Once the data permit is granted, now the data user can perform all of the analysis. That being said, all of the data that are coming from patients and are held by data holders in the IDEA4RC scenarios, these are the centers of expertise comprised by specialized hospitals and clinics across Europe, focusing heavily on rare cancer research. They are never sharing the actual data with the data user. The data never leaves their premises. As within each hospital, there is now an IDEA4RC capsule, as we call it, where data is locally analyzed, and then it is aggregated, and the user only receives aggregated results from all of the centers participating in the cohort that it has decided. This means that it cannot receive patients' data per se. It will only receive the results of this analysis in an aggregated form. And this is a very key point for the IDEA4RC ecosystem, as it includes this federated learning approach, which means precisely that each analysis is performed locally at each hospital, and then all of these already aggregated results are combined in a more aggregated format and then given back to the data user in order to be able to best protect patients and not expose any of their personal data in the process. Now, this is the EHDS data permit journey. So, of course, there is the data discovery phase, which then leads to the data permit application, data preparation. The data permit is granted. Then there is the data use through secure processing ecosystem, and then you have the results outputs. The IDEA4RC ecosystem has been designed since the start in order to be fully aligned with this. And it has, of course, specified certain elements to match the personal specificities of the project. Meaning the data discovery is done through a data discovery tool, which is available in the IDEA4RC platform itself. Through the data governance layer, the data permit application is filed fully electronically, and it only needs to be completed once, even though there are multiple centers of excellence that will be seeing the application. The data user doesn't have to go to all 11 centers of excellence and file different applications, but they only provide the information once, and then the centers receive it and review it according to their own procedures. And then, of course, there is a cohort builder which collects the relevant information in order to identify which partners would be relevant for this purposes that are mentioned in the data permit application. And then again, through the web interface, the data user is informed about whether the data permit has been granted or it has been denied, and the reasons of any rejection. Then through this federated learning approach that I described, the data can be used, and through the user interface, the user acquires all of these aggregated results back. And I think that concludes it, because I also saw the time.
Okay.
So yes, thank you very much. Of course, we will now move into the Q&A session. So if you have any questions or comments, we will be happy to receive them. And of course, as Luna mentioned, you can already join the community of interest and subscribe to the newsletter. And I will give the floor.
Yes. Okay, thank you, Vasiliki, for your impressive presentation. Now, let's move to the Q&A session. I can see one person. Okay, we have the first comment. Okay. I think, Mohsen, you can open your microphone so we can, okay. We can't hear you. Okay, maybe please. No, we can't hear you. Okay, does anyone want to break the ice? No one? Okay, we have the first question. Which tool will be used for filling the learning?
I'm sorry, what?
Maybe you can read the question directly because,
yes.
Okay, just.
Which tool will be used for federated learning? Okay. So the entire IDEA4RC ecosystem, as I mentioned, is indeed based on federated learning. This means that every hospital now has their own capsule where they store the data, and the analysis is actually performed using the framework and ecosystem developed by IKNL, which is the Cancer Institute in the Netherlands. And the main system that is currently being used is Vantage 6 in order to be able to perform the analysis.
Okay, perfect. We have another question. Can you please show the slide with the QR code? Thank you. Okay. Here you are. Okay. There is another question. I noticed that in presentation mention was made to public and general interest as a reason to justify secondary data use and data altruism respectively. Are there notable differences between how public and general interests are defined? If so, which?
So practically, as you can also understand, and I think this is the reason behind the question, public and general interest are actually very closely related. Now, public interest has a lot to do with how the administration at a, let's say, member state level has defined the public goals, public objectives, the public order, public health, etc. So it is very much aligned with how they identify the public elements and the public interest elements of it, while general interest is also what is identified as a need within the system. An example of that would be the COVID needs, for instance. Of course, they are very heavily related because the need to perform research in order to develop, let's say, COVID vaccines was very much a general interest that would affect the entire population. And it was then integrated in the public health objectives. And hence why it moved in the way it did, and it received the funding, and it was heavily pushed within this member state order. But in practice, public and general interest are very closely interrelated. It is only the terminology that is used in the legislations regarding this.
Okay, perfect.
Yes. So there is another question: will there be an opt-out option for patients? Practically, yes. The European Health Data Space Regulation provides this possibility both for the primary use, but also for the secondary use. Now, specifically for the secondary use, if any of the patients want to opt out, they can directly contact the data holders, which in this scenario are the hospitals, clinics, and any data holder involved in the ecosystem. And the reason behind this is, the reason behind why it's not possible to contact, for instance, the health data access body for this, especially in how the IDEA4RC ecosystem is built, is because the rest of the partners actually do not have any access to the data. Not even the people that have set up the capsules, they don't even know what is inside the capsules because they are locally stored in order to protect patients' privacy. This practically means that if a patient reaches out to a hospital with an opt-out request, the hospital has to comply and they have to remove the data out of the system. Now, if the data has already been anonymized and there is this opt-out option, it is a bit trickier, as you will have to go back to the original data set that was anonymized and remove it from there and then input it in the platform again.
Okay, so we have another question. So
yes. Is the new EU regulation on the reuse of health data valid also for Switzerland and Liechtenstein? So Switzerland and Liechtenstein are indeed not members of the European Union. They are members of the European Economic Area. So that means that the regulation is applicable to them in a different kind of manner, as everything is in those scenarios. So there are certain elements that they will be able to slowly start benefiting from, but they are not required to participate in this ecosystem and data sharing per se. And it is always the case with such elements. For instance, you cannot use the European health card in those countries, as you still would need to have a different type of arrangements made.
Okay. There is another question.
Has this work been coordinated with UK's federated data platforms experience? I am not sure. Very straightforward. I'm not familiar with the UK federated data platforms experience, so I cannot provide more information on this. But I would be very, very glad to learn more. So if you would like, you can always reach out to us and we can continue this discussion further. But now I will move on to the next question as well.
Yeah.
I understand that since the GDPR still applies, data access applications will be needed with all the information required. How does IDEA4RC handle this application and how it directs it to multiple centers who contribute with data? How will IDEA4RC facilitate this part of the data user journey? Thank you. Indeed, since the GDPR applies, data access applications are needed. As I explained, this is the data permit vision. I think I can also go back a bit to the slide so we can see it in real time. So the IDEA4RC ecosystem has built this entire platform and this digital tool in order to be able to submit those data access requests, data access applications, the data permit applications, whatever you call it, in providing all of the information required. In order to do that, we have taken the time to discuss with each and every hospital involved in the IDEA4RC ecosystem to identify the specific needs according to the national legislation. This means that we have already identified the information that is required on one hand by the GDPR, the European Health Data Space, but also national legislation for each of the hospitals. Based on this, the data user is called to provide this information once. And then all of the hospitals that are involved in this procedure are notified through the IDEA4RC platform and now have to access into the platform to review the application. And once they review it and all of the conditions are met, they then proceed with the data permit by signing through a digital signature tool in order to be able to grant the data permit and proceed. So that practically means that the data user only has to provide the information once, and then the hospitals digitally have access to this information, and they can see how this is aligned with everything that they require, which of course they have to cross-check in order to validate that this indeed is possible and lawful. I hope that answers the question, but if there is something more, please feel free to follow up. And I see we have another question. Could you explain again who is setting up and maintaining the capsules? Yes, of course. So the capsules are installed within the hospital, so they are locally installed, and this is where the data is locally stored and processed. So it is the hospitals that have set up the capsules with the assistance of the IDEA4RC technical partners, of course, who have not had any access to the data, but they have helped in the establishment of the technical framework. And they are always there to help the centers of excellence in, of course, also maintaining and also solving any problems that may arise along the way. But ultimately, it is the hospitals that are running the capsules in their entirety.
Okay, we have the last question.
Can a patient access information about how their data is being used in research? Indeed, patients do have access to this information. Once the IDEA4RC ecosystem is in place, there will be a dedicated section as to what type of data permits are being granted and for which purposes, so they can easily go back to it. And of course, that is the general information that is provided for each and one data permit that has been granted. So it is very evident what type of data have been used in order to perform the research and how this is aligned with all of the requirements, but also for which purposes. In addition to that, patients still maintain all of the GDPR prescribed rights, meaning they can always go back to the hospitals and require further information about how their data is being processed in this specific element. I also see another question. Heterogeneity of implementation of the GDPR across EU member states has been one of the challenges of cross-border sharing of health data. How the EU is behaving to avoid this happens again with the EHDS? If and how IDEA4RC or similar projects can help in this sense? Thank you very much for the question. This is indeed a key point and the main reason why I wanted to discuss the existing challenges before delving deeper into the EHDS itself, because the EHDS has come precisely to solve this problem of lack of homogeneity across member states. So now the idea is that, of course, there are more detailed requirements for how member states have to abide by the legislation. And they all have to report back to authorities that will be established specifically for this purpose and that can monitor this type of things. Now, starting, of course, from the lawful basis, which is the main point of lack of homogeneity across the EU, the EHDS provides precisely for this homogenized legal basis that everyone across Europe can use, which is the legal obligation in this scenario. Now, regarding the rest of the elements about how health data access bodies are supposed to be operating and all of these more specific elements, the EHDS has actually provided a lot of specific requirements for member states in order to avoid having any lack of homogeneity in any aspect. Similarly, IDEA4RC has been taking this into account since the start, which is why for the first phase of the project, we had this type of co-creation approach precisely to identify those points that are differing in each country, and also to be able to raise them within the European Commission as well. And based on these findings, IDEA4RC and other projects in this field, such as TEDAS 1 and 2, EHDS 2 pilot, they have consistently been in discussions with the European Commission, both in the context of the research project, but also in the context of other initiatives, in order to highlight the need for this purpose. Projects like this one and all of these activities with engaging with policymakers have been able to precisely describe why the framework was problematic and what were the changes that researchers but specifically needed to see in order to be able to move ahead.
Okay.
So, yes.
Perfect. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm afraid we are running out of time. So if you can perhaps write your question or answer in the chat, we can go ahead with the live opinion poll.
Yes.
Thank you for comprehensive. And okay, now I will launch the live opinion poll. So you can respond directly using your device, and the question should be appear as a pop-up window. So you can respond. Please note that the responses are collected in anonymous fashion. So thank you. Okay, just wait 1 more minute to allow everyone to complete the filling in. Okay, I think we can stop the poll. Thank you for your feedback. And now I will use the last minute for remind you about next webinar, which is scheduled in April. Okay, you should be able to see my presentation. Okay. In this webinar, we will have 2 speakers, Vasiliki, who will explain the data altruism concept as described in European Union Data Governance Act, and Joanna Drimpeta, a legal informatics expert at the Center of Research and Technology Hellas in Greece, who will show a demo of the tools developed by CERT to facilitate individual data donation in IDEA4RC ecosystem. The registration link will be sent to all of you in a follow-up mail and also be shared through the IDEA4RC communication channels. Before leaving, I'd like to acknowledge our speaker, Vasiliki, my colleague Lidia Villanova for her amazing work as IDEA4RC Stakeholder Engagement Coordinator, Chiara Sabelli and Maria Luisa Clementi, our communication expert, and last but not least, our project coordinator, Annalisa Trama, from the National Cancer Institute in Milan. Thank you all for your attention. I truly hope you enjoy the webinar and that you will stay connected by joining our community or subscribing to our newsletter. It was a pleasure having with us, and I wish you a wonderful evening. Bye, everyone.